Hi everyone. My name is Vicky Rotherham. I am at Shrewsbury School in Bangkok, and I have been here for 11 years. And for about 5 or 6 years now, I've been on the CPD executive team for Region A. So I lead, alongside my current colleague Morgan, the CPD planning for Region A, along with the rest of the team. And it's a job that I hugely value, and a job that really helps, both in terms of networking, but also sense check the trends around the region in terms of CPD, in terms of leadership. And we're always asking ourselves, what can we do better and what can we do more of? And a few years ago, the idea of the fellowship was introduced. And over time, it has become quite the valuable program with colleagues such as Matthew presenting today and a whole host of different projects and different sort of scenarios and outcomes and all sorts of different things. But the most important part of it is actually these webinars, these moments where Matthew and co and all the different cohort members get to present to us their thoughts live in the moment. So they also have to produce an academic journal. They also have to speak at the heads conference. But this is probably the most accessible opportunity for everyone because this is open to all Fabricia members, and those of us who don't get to go to the heads conference as often can learn from Matthew. So Matthew is the deputy head of secondary school at Lanna International School, which is in Chiang Mai here in Thailand. So he's about an hour's flight from me in Bangkok. And he has been the deputy head of secondary there at Lanna International School for 6 years now. When I looked at his CV, I thought, wow, he's a really busy fella. His current role is so wide and varied, and he's got a huge range of qualifications, which guarantee that this webinar is going to be full of useful things to take away. So have your pens ready to write down loads of information. He's hugely busy at Lanna. He's a deputy head. He supports staff development and he supports student growth. So I can't imagine how he's found the time to become a Fabricia fellow as well as that, all those wonderful things that he's doing. So I'm going to hand over now to you, Matthew. Congratulations on becoming a Fabricia fellow. I'm really excited to listen in today. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. Gives me great pleasure to be able to present this webinar today. So being selected as a Fabricia Fellow, I think probably a year ago, was a really exciting opportunity for me to be able to delve into or to understand and delve into a topic that I care really passionately about, and that's student voice. So, excuse me. So the topic that I chose, and I guess the title of my project, Every Voice Matters. So building a culture of student voice and authentic engagement. So this webinar, and I guess the project itself, is not really about creating another initiative or program, but really about asking a much bigger question. So how do we create schools where students genuinely feel heard? And perhaps even more importantly, how do we create structures that allow student voice to influence real decisions in a sustainable and meaningful ways? So over the next 35 to 40 minutes, I'm going to walk you through kind of the research and the literature that informed this project, how the project was designed, the major findings that emerged from student-led inquiry, the challenges that we encountered, and there were many because it was very much involved students and a lot of challenges on the way. And then finally, I'm going to share with you a practical framework that came out of this project, which should hopefully allow other schools to be able to adapt and bring in a kind of student-centered project like this into your own context. So my hope is that by the end of today, by the end of this session, that you'll leave with practical ideas, but also with a renewed sense that student voice is not simply an educational trend, but something that is fundamental to the development of students and to the progress of schools. So it's about not only building relationships in schools, but it's about trust. It's very much to do with about creating that sense of belonging in schools and about shared ownership of the community in the school. So to me, it's become a really big part of my leadership in school, and something that I'm really proud of the progress that we've made this year in the project. So first of all, I want to share with you why this matters. So before discussing the project, just try and give you a sense of why this matters to me personally. So there is a large body of educational research that already shows that when students are meaningfully involved in school processes, that their engagement, their sense of belonging, their motivation, and the enjoyment of school tends to grow with it and increase. Yet, despite this, many schools still struggle to move beyond fairly kind of superficial forms of student participation. So many schools' student councils exist primarily to organize events, to raise money, or discuss kind of relatively low stakes issues. And through that, students tend to be, in many schools, consulted kind of occasionally, but then they are often very genuinely involved in, want to be involved in decisions that affect their daily lives. And that's certainly the experience that I've had in school. So at our school, we recognise several concerns. First, there was a feeling that the existing student council didn't have a particularly meaningful role in governance or school improvement. Second, there was limited student involvement in any decision making. And third, there were many assumptions that were being made about what students wanted, what they needed, or what they valued, without really actually asking them or getting to know what it is that they actually wanted and needed. And lastly, the project's kind of really deeply personal to me. So I think back to when I was in school, and unfortunately, I didn't have a picture of myself when I was in school. So I asked my AI friend to make one of me, and it came up with this is what you can see. Looking very kind of solemn, I guess. But this was kind of my experience of school. I felt not involved at all as a student growing up myself in the UK. I often felt that schools spoke about students far more than they spoke with students. That education was something done to me, not with me. And many young people spend the majority of their lives within educational institutions, of course, yet they frequently have very little influence about how those institutions operate. And that's kind of stayed with me throughout my career, and ultimately became one of the driving motivations for me behind this project. So I'm not going to delve too greatly into the literature on this, but just give you a bit of an overview of the student voice literature. I think four key articles and texts that kind of were instrumental to this project for me. So the first is Dana Mitra. Dana Mitra's work on student voice and school reform. So Mitra argues that students should not simply be viewed as passive recipients of education, instead that they should act as genuine partners in school improvement. Her research highlights how meaningful student participation can strengthen agency, leadership, democratic participation, and connectedness in school. So what I particularly appreciated about Mitra's work was the idea that student voice is not just beneficial for students themselves. It can actually improve schools' overall capacity for change. The second major influence was Jean Ruddock and Julia Flutter. So their work focused on how schools improve when students are meaningfully consulted about teaching, learning, and school culture. So importantly, their work challenged the idea that student voice should not be confined to just symbolic student councils. Instead, they argued for consultative leadership and genuine pupil participation. And one of the key takeaways from this literature was that authentic student voice requires schools to move beyond making it occasional consultation. It requires structures, it requires relationships, and a willingness to share aspects of power and decision making. Something which I know as a leader in a school is quite difficult for many leaders and owners of schools also to relinquish that power and decision making. Two further studies that were really important and hugely important to me in this process. The first being Michael Fielding on student voice and the possibility of radical democratic education. Fielding was particularly influential because he challenged what he described as superficial or tokenistic approaches to student voice. He argues that schools often collect student feedback without fundamentally changing the power relationship. In other words, students may be asked for opinions, but they rarely actually have influence. And that was something that came about in the structures that we had in our school that we often ask, but there's very little kind of known impact of what students are actually inputting. And sorry, losing my track here. And Fielding as well pushed the conversation further. He viewed student voice as a part of a broader democratic community. So not simply feedback collection, not simply surveys, but shared authority, shared responsibility, and shared ownership of the school culture. I also explored more recent literature, including in 2023, again, another by Dana Mitra and Jarosh O'Connor. And this newer research increasingly defines student voice through participation in governance and the collaborative decision making. And one of the more other areas of interest to me at the moment, distributed leadership as well. So looking at how you can change the structures within schools of staff leadership to actually bring about greater support for student collaboration as well. So one of the major shifts in the literature over the past 2 decades has been the movement away from isolated programs towards embedded systems and structures. And this shift towards having that, to making it more of an embedded structure is really how I kind of wanted to develop this project. And this is, as I'll get into now, how we move towards building this Every Voice Matters project and how it was designed. Excuse me. So I'm going to look now at, I'll just bring it all up actually. So the project, how we designed the project and our approach. So how did the project actually begin? So one of the major lessons from the literature was that authentic student voice cannot simply be designed by us as adults and then handed to students. If we wanted students to genuinely shape the culture, they needed to be involved from the very beginning. So rather than creating a ready-made program, we invited students to help design the project itself. Initially, a call for involvement attracted a relatively small but highly committed group of students from different year groups, students from as young as year 7 all the way up to year 13. So around a dozen students volunteered to become the kind of founding members of what we called the Every Voice Matters research group. And what was important initially is that the group itself, they adopted leadership structures. So they selected a chairperson, they selected a secretary from amongst themselves, and then there was this strong emphasis on making it practical and student-led from the very beginning. The central question guiding the work was, how do we build a school where student voice isn't a slogan, but a lived reality? And the overall objective was simply not to improve our own school, but also to develop a practical roadmap that other schools could potentially adapt within their own context. Not working my animations very well here. So how did the project develop from there? So once the group had formed, we needed to identify where student voice was most needed. And again, it was very clear to me that I wanted to make this student-led. So this involved consultation with the students and the school leadership to consider areas of student involvement that could realistically contribute to improvement. So we wanted to not just let students have complete free rein over areas. We wanted them to have areas that we know that we could develop greater input for them, and that they could actually have a real amount of feedback to actually bring in about positive change. So initially, I think we ended up around 9 or 10 different areas, but we whittled them down to about 6 core areas, which are presented here. So these 6. So in terms of facilities, school governance, safeguarding and well-being, digital learning and technology, teaching and learning, and teacher recruitment. So these were these initially were, for us anyway, in our context, the 6 key priority areas for us. And the research itself that they undertook was conducted using a variety of different methods. So this included focus groups. So students set up their own focus groups to gather feedback on how students are involved in those processes. They sent out digital surveys, and they also use the current student council homeroom reps as a way of gathering further feedback. One of the difficulties at the beginning was that students saw themselves as kind of acting as the student council, and I had to constantly reiterate the point that we're looking at the structure, we're looking at how you are having student voice, not so much what the issues are, but how is it that we're building a structure so that students down the line can have greater input into the decision making of the school. And so for us to do that, using multiple methods was very, very important. So focus groups tend to attract those students that are more willing to put themselves front and center and share ideas. But also digital surveys meant that we also reached those students that were maybe a little shyer and wanted to have a more anonymous way of sharing their viewpoints. So having a variety of different methods for that was really, really important. Another important principle was that these six areas that we focused on emerged through dialogue and inquiry. So they weren't simply imposed by us, but and that was really important about having the students decide what it is that they wanted to have input into. Move on to the next one. Okay, so I'll just go a little bit more into each of those ones to give an example of what it is that became the aim and the findings for each of those six key areas, certainly for us as a school. So the first major one was the first major area that students wanted to have a greater voice in was in terms of facilities. So we're actually just today, we had a soft opening of a brand new facility in the school, a brand new building. And this because of the building of this new innovation center, students saw it as they questioned the amount of input that they'd had into what's going in it, how it's designed, and that sort of thing. So I think this become a key thing for them, and one of the major areas that they were interested in having more voice. And not only that, they consistently identified facilities across the school as areas of improvement and something that they wanted to have greater voice in as well. So then many students felt that significant decisions regarding the buildings, regarding shared spaces and other learning environments, they were often made without meaningful student consultation. So one quote that came back from one of the digital surveys is that nobody asked us what we wanted in the new building, which I thought was an interesting quote, which I included here. But students raised several practical concerns. So through that they wanted more shaded outdoor seating, they wanted cleaner toilets, better shared learning spaces, and more flexible independent study areas. So none of these ideas were particularly radical, but what mattered was that the students had strong insights into how the spaces affected their daily experiences. So the issue was not necessarily that schools intentionally ignored students. The issue was that there often weren't structures in place to gather student perspectives before decisions were made. As a result, one of the key recommendations from the group that worked on the facilities was that they wanted to establish a formal consultation process for facilities planning. So this included using student representatives in campus development discussions and improving communication around which suggestions were feasible and why. And that final part's especially important because as one of the things that I've learned throughout this process is that student voice is not about saying yes to everything. And often the perception I've learned from students is that when we are not following through on one of their suggestions, they interpret that as that we've not listened, but obviously that's not so much the case. And so increasing the transparency and the dialogue about how decisions are made, that their views were taken into consideration. Yet we've had to go in this direction, or this is how we've made a decision. I think that's become a big part of this, and that kind of idea goes through all of these 6 areas that we looked into. The next important area for students that they focused on was safeguarding and well-being, so the second area. Students expressed a strong desire to be more involved in well-being initiatives. And this one actually surprised me. Of all of the things, it surprised me the most that they had so much interest in this. Many students believe that young people often understand emerging student concerns before adults become aware of them. They felt it was a view that they actually are aware of these things better than we are, and that they should actually have more of a leading role, which, as I say, probably one of the more surprising ones, and something that I underestimated, I think, me personally, in my role. One particularly powerful student comment was that we know what problems students are actually dealing with. And I guess as teachers, we tend to think that we know our students quite well. But I think tapping into the fact that there are lots of students with great connections with each other and great relationships, that they know each other better than we know them, I think suggested to me that this is an area that has a lot of potential to support us in how we run pastoral programs and that thing. So involving students in being like safeguarding and well-being leaders. So through these through the surveys, through the focus groups, they discussed issues relating to stress, peer relationships, school culture, mental health. And interestingly, many students were especially interested in peer-led approaches. So having wellbeing ambassadors, more peer mentoring, and student-led wellbeing initiatives were a big part of this again. And at the same time, this area also highlighted important boundaries. So student voice in safeguarding requires careful structure and adult oversight. So we obviously have to be very careful in this particular domain as to how we're supporting students, because students are not safeguarding professionals. So this is an area, whilst it's great to have more student involvement, it's something that we do have to be cautious about. However, they can provide an extremely valuable insight into school culture and student experiences. So the project, therefore, from this group, the group that worked on this area of the project, greater student involvement in wellbeing initiatives, clearer student understanding of safeguarding responsibilities. They wanted to know more about this, and us to be sharing more and having training with students about this, and stronger connections between student voice and PSHE as well, which I thought was really, really helpful. So what became very clear was that students often possess a much deeper awareness of peer culture than adults often realize, which maybe that's not so much of a surprise, but it was to me at the time. The next main area that our third main area that our students focused on was that of digital learning and technology. This was one of the most passionately discussed topics across the project. So they consistently reported, the students did, that technology-related policies were often created without meaningful student input. Now, if you have technology policies in your school, I'm sure this probably doesn't come as much of a surprise, but mobile phone policies, laptop expectations, what digital platforms you should and should not be accessing, and responsible technology use. Students are very, very passionate about this topic. One student commented that most of the tech rules get decided without asking us. And so what stood out during this research was that students often had highly thoughtful and nuanced perspectives. It wasn't simply that students were asking for fewer rules or for us to take those rules away, but they demonstrated a strong awareness of the benefits and risks of technology, and that their input needed to be heard in a more structured way. I'm just wary of time. I think I'm rambling a little. I'm going to skip to the next one. So I do want to cover everything in this. School governance. This turned out to be probably the largest area. This is our fourth area, and focused directly on school governance, and perhaps most widely or most closely connected to the wider aims of the project. So students in general reported very limited opportunities to influence policies and decision making. And again, the existing student council was frequently viewed as having relatively little influence beyond organising events. And as one student put it there quite bluntly, student council feels like it's mostly for organising events. And at the same time, students consistently valued opportunities to engage in dialogue with school leaders. Importantly, participation in the Every Voice Matters project itself appeared to strengthen their trust and their understanding between students and the leadership. And it highlighted an important point that student voice is not simply about changing decisions, but sometimes the process of dialogue itself helps to improve that relationship and that transparency. And that's something I learned a lot through the whole process. Is initially there was a lot of skepticism, a lot of distrust of what we were actually doing. And through this process of students engaging in it and listening to me and my understanding, I think we developed greater trust about what we were trying to achieve. So the recommendations or the next steps from this area included creating clearer pathways for student consultation, exploring more meaningful student roles in governance, clarifying the relationship between Every Voice Matters and Student Council, because there was growing tension between these two groups. I think where Student Council felt that the Every Voice Matters group were doing their work, but it wasn't. They were trying to get to that point that the Every Voice Matters project is trying to help empower the Student Council more. And that's something I think we have to continue working on. So one challenge many schools face is balancing student involvement with practical realities. So not every decision can or should be fully collaborative, but students should understand where they can influence decisions and how those processes work. And that was one of the key areas that came out through our research, our student-led research into school governance. Our fifth main area was focusing on the quality of teaching and learning. So students reported through the surveys, through the focus groups, quite a variation in classroom experiences and opportunities for feedback within those classrooms and from those teachers as well. So some teachers actively invited student voice, others rarely did. So they saw quite a difference between one classroom and the next. And as we know already, students expressed a strong willingness to provide feedback. They really wanted to be involved. They really wanted to give constructive feedback about their learning experiences, but felt frustrated about it. In many cases, there was a lack of opportunity to do that. So one student posed a very reasonable question: if teachers work with us every day, shouldn't we have more input? And this became a very particularly interesting area because students generally approached it quite maturely. You obviously get when you do these surveys and focus groups, some, especially with the younger students, some level of immaturity, but in general, the approach that students took were very, very mature and very, very constructive. So they saw it as simply not a way just to be criticizing teachers, but actually they wanted to provide constructive, helpful feedback. They wanted to have that dialogue and they wanted to have more opportunities to discuss things like learning approaches, the classroom climate, how assessment is operated and how they're engaging in classes. So as a result, the project from this group that worked on teaching and learning recommended a more consistent framework for student feedback. So encouraging all teachers to periodically gather student perspectives rather than just once a year, or in some cases never, and developing constructive mechanisms for sharing feedback professionally. And one important point here is that student voice in teaching and learning requires a trust on both sides. Teachers need that reassurance as well, that student feedback is intended to improve learning rather than to evaluate them as teachers. It's used to help them and support them rather than as a judgment of their teaching. And students need reassurance, obviously, that their views are genuinely going to be valued and taken into consideration. The final area that our school focused on was on that of teacher recruitment. And this one was probably one of the most innovative parts of the project. And I think where we found the most wins, if you like, I think we made the most progress. So students expressed a strong desire to participate in recruitment processes. Many argued that if teachers are going to work with them every day, then their perspectives should matter, their opinion should matter. And so what we ended up developing from this, from the research findings, was actually developing pretty quickly student-led student panels for interviews. So it became part of our recruitment process that after the first or second round of interview, a candidate would move to a student round where we had students set up with their own questions, supported and by a teacher, either myself or another member of leadership or another head of department, while they were interviewing the teachers themselves. And it actually generated fantastic feedback, not just from the students, but also from the applicants as well for the various roles that we were recruiting for. They reported that it gave them a sense of understanding about the school, about our students' capabilities, their passions, and that sort of thing. So actually, it was really, really beneficial, not just for the students to have that engagement in the recruitment process, but also for prospective teachers to be able to learn more about the school and our students as well. So it was really, really helpful. It improved communication about how student feedback influenced the hiring decisions, and it ensured that the panels, what we made sure, sorry, was that the panels of students that we had were representative of the wider student body. So a mix of gender, a mix of age groups. So it really gave a nice representative view of our student body. So those were the six key areas that we as a school actually focused on. So what I actually want to then look at next and talk about is exactly what it is that what we learned from this process. So after a year of student-led inquiry, 6 work streams or six committees and countless conversations, one thing became clear. Authentic student voice is not created through programs or events, it's built through structure. So 3 lessons emerged: that we build this with students, not for students, that they were most engaged when they helped design the process themselves. At times it was frustrating. It was frustrating for me, it was frustrating for them, but the whole process itself was just as important as the outcome. Point 2 there, creating structures, so not events. We wanted to make sure that we were creating lasting impact from clear pathways for participation and feedback, and with a view to later putting that, as point 3 says, into a policy. So not something that's going to leave or stop when I leave the school at the end of this year, but something that's going to become a formal structure that remains vulnerable, that doesn't remain vulnerable to staff turnover and changing priorities, that becomes part of the culture and is embedded in policy. So the challenges that we encountered through the whole process, student commitment did vary over time. As I mentioned, many students found the process at times can be frustrating. We had a few changes in student participation, but most of them, the core group, stayed there throughout the whole program. Progress was often slower than anticipated. If I'd have done this project myself, as I said, imposing it from me down, it would have been obviously much faster, but then with certainly not the same outcomes and not the same level of authenticity that I think that this student-led progress has made. There were tensions between the Every Voice Matters group and our student council. I think to be nice to the student council, I think it exposed the limitations that they currently have, and what things they needed to do. In effect, it's kind of creating more work for them. So I think they felt it as that. The school structures sometimes limited how far student influence could extend. So when we were putting through recommendations and things, sometimes it became frustrating when we realized that there were certain obstacles that couldn't be overcome, such as, for example, with facilities and that sort of thing, where decisions had already been made, and that made it very, very difficult sometimes to be able to explain that to students, that yes, you can have input into certain areas, but in other areas, the decision's already been made. So the structures that were already in place did limit how far that student influence could extend. So the result, rather than creating another student voice initiative, we developed a practical roadmap for schools to build authentic voice into culture, governance, and decision making. So from that, from our experience, I'm now going to how are we doing for time? Now going to delve a little bit into the framework that we've created, which hopefully other schools can develop and use in their own context. Sorry, rushing ahead. So the first step for any school is really securing leadership commitment. So before involving students, I would suggest that the leadership and including owners as well, I think is important in that, which I didn't do, which I'm learning should have been the case, is before involving students, school leadership must agree to three principles. Student voices about improvement, not complaints. Students will influence decisions, not simply provide feedback. And feedback will always receive a response, even when suggestions cannot be implemented. And that's one of the key areas, that last one particularly, that I think we have, as a school, have done better at and will hope to continue doing better. So the output of this is that we have a published student voice charter now signed by the school leadership, agreeing that this is the role that students will have. Step two, forming a student research group, which is what we've done. So rather than beginning with the student council, establish a temporary student voice research group. So this group exists outside of the student council, almost as they're not elected like the student council. They're appointed, or they volunteer to take part. They work kind of as an auditor, if you like, of the student council, of the student leaders, to see and help them to shape how they can contribute more positively in the school. So membership of the research group should be voluntary. It should represent different year groups. It should be diverse in terms of academic and social backgrounds. And then developing leadership positions within that as well. So a chair, a secretary, a communications lead. And the role of this group is to design the system itself. So this mirrors the Every Voice Matters approach, where students became the architects of the project from the beginning. And so then the output of that obviously was that the team is established. The third step on this roadmap would be conducting a student voice audit, which is exactly what we did. So we asked where do students currently have influence? Where are decisions made without student involvement? What structures already exist? And what frustrates students the most? So how did we do that? We did it through surveys, focus groups, interviews, and existing student council review. And then we developed our student voice audit report from that to get a greater understanding of where students currently have a lot of input and where they don't, and where they want to have more input. And then step four was the domains, or the committees, if you like, or the areas, the work streams which students want to have greater voice in. And I think this one is very much context dependent. It depends on the school, it depends on the students from the initial audit. So students identify the areas where voice is most needed. So our project identified 6, and this was a manageable amount, perhaps a little, I would say 6 is enough. More than that makes it unmanageable. And these emerged again from student-led inquiry, the audit, rather than being imposed by adults. And that's a very important step. If they don't make that decision, if they don't choose that themselves, they're not going to be invested in doing the research about those areas. And then, so from that, we had permanent advisory groups. This is what we did, and I suggest doing that. So for each of the 6 domains that we had a core team of about 4 to 8 students in each little group, and they were ideally linked with a leader. So for example, the Safeguarding and Wellbeing Committee, I was able to recruit our designated safeguarding lead to support them as well. So that was helpful in helping them. I go back to the example of the safeguarding group, that to know how far they can go with that, and where they certainly can't have too much input or too much influence into those processes, but what they can do and what they can't. And that was really helpful to have someone that supports each group to give them a bit of guidance. But again, it's important to make sure that leader is not telling them, but advising them and just giving them some mentoring as such. Step 6 is really geared around having multiple feedback channels. So avoid relying solely on reps. We had initially just student representatives in our student council, and that was how we thought we were supporting greater student voice and leadership. But it really isn't sufficient. It's one method, but really needs to be partnered with things like focus groups, with in-person surveys and anonymous surveys as well. So the output is there that you've got a variety of different ways of collecting student voice and student feedback. The seventh area, introducing a you said we did process. So each of the areas actually talked about this is more transparency from the leadership about what we've actually done with their feedback. So every recommendation receives one of three outcomes: approved, under review, not currently possible. So within each of those, it's important that we give explanations for why those decisions are made. And that was a key thing about that came through in all of the group's research. It's important to explain why decisions are made, and that really helps to build that trust with the students that are involved. As I've already mentioned, the critical element there is transparency. Step 8, establishing a student decision-making protocol. So this was something that I personally suggested just from what I saw, and maybe an optional choice in that roadmap is developing based on the areas in which students are wanting to have input, is really consulting with the experts in those areas and identifying how much input and how much feedback they can actually have. So I looked at having kind of a protocol, a categorization of areas. So, for example, if you're wanting to have greater input into safeguarding and well-being measures and things like that, we need to define how much input you can have. So would it be that you're simply informed of decisions, you would take a consultative view, or you're more collaborators in that decision making? So this could be a useful framework for developing and sharing with students how much input that they can have. Something that I think when we push this project forward the next year, I'd like to see implemented for us as well. And then an annual step 9 would be an annual student voice review. So participation, looking at participation, the number of students involved, continuing to review the diversity of participation, and visibility. So are students aware of any changes? That's something that needs to be part of that annual review. And also reviewing the culture, finding ways to assess student trust, belonging, and student agency. And also looking at the influence it's having. How many, trying to quantify the number of recommendations that have been accepted or number of policy changes, and then putting that into an annual student voice impact report would be a suggestion, and something that we want to develop as well. And I would suggest that would be really helpful, again, at showing how student voice is growing in a school, and helping you to identify the areas in which it can be improved in the future. And the final step, building the whole structure into a policy. So to avoid dependence on individual staff, just carrying it, it needs to be put into writing. It needs to become a school policy with a leadership responsibility to make sure that continues, and that includes student voice expectations in strategic planning as well. So this last step directly addresses one of the final challenges identified in the project, ensuring that student voice survives staff turnover and becomes embedded in governance. So the only way that cultures really permeate is if you build it into projects, if you build it into strategy, and it really needs to be built into a school strategy if you want it to become part of the part of the furniture, I should say. Okay, I'm wary of time, and I've gone a little over, so I'm just going to skip over this last one. So what's next? So for me personally, I'm leaving my school along with another teacher that's been a member of this group. We're passing on the stewardship of the group to our head of sixth form. They will continue to focus on the 6 core areas, continuing to push for continued progress in those, and continuing to develop proposals that can be embedded into school governance. And one of the key areas for us as well at the school is identifying how the Every Voice Matters group can be assimilated into the existing student council structure. The image there, I didn't make that at the bottom. That was the logo that our group made. I didn't ask them to put my face in the middle, but it ended up being that way. That's what's next for the school in terms of Every Voice Matters, and for me. So I just want to summarize now that saying that Student Voice is not a program, it's not a council, it's not a survey, it's a commitment to ensuring that decisions affecting students are made with them, not simply for them. And that importantly, the key part of it is that every voice matters, and finding ways that you can push and promote that to develop that sense of belonging is fundamental to however you end up designing a project to enhance student voice. Just to close then, I want to give special thanks to a few people, teachers that have been supportive, to Sean, to Alex, to Bank and John, that have been very helpful in supporting me at the school, to Mark, who's been my mentor throughout this whole process, and obviously to the student members of the Every Voice Research Matters group. They've been absolutely fantastic all the way through. I'm sharing my contact details there. I'm actually moving on to a new school, so I've also shared my new email address for anyone that would like to reach out and find out more. I wish I could have delved more deeply into the project in the time. I thought I would have more time than I did, than I planned for. But if anyone would like to find out more about this and developing this kind of project in your own school, please reach out to me. My LinkedIn's there. You can reach me at either of the 2 emails. And that's it from me. I'm open to any questions.
Thank you, Matthew. So much to think about there. For this year, not for this year, so actually will we be sharing those slides, or how will colleagues who are watching it have access to the content? Because that visual aid was so beautifully designed, but obviously too much to take in just now. So something that could possibly be studied and implemented in other schools. Swati?
Yes, we will do that.
Yeah, okay.
We'll share the slides, as well as this webinar would be uploaded on our website.
Okay. If you have any questions, please pop them in the chat box. I have one quick question while we're waiting to see if anyone else has questions. How did those students respond when they put time into researching, into meetings, into everything else, and perhaps what they anticipated would be successful wasn't successful, perhaps around the learning environment or any of those things? How did they respond? And then as a leader, what was your role in sort of saying, right, come on, get back on it, we're going to try something else, so that they weren't disheartened?
So in terms of if they put forward suggestions that
were not agreed upon.
And that's I think that's continues to be a problem, I think. So it's difficult. One of the things, certainly with the group that I meet with, I've been meeting with them every Thursday at lunchtime. We meet every week, and we talk about, and they share, and I'll give an example. Uniform's been something that we've been looking to change, our 6th form uniform. And if anyone's ever spoken with students about uniform, everyone has a different opinion about it.
For sure.
Yeah, and I guess the outcome, the new uniform that's being implemented, it obviously it can't look like everything from every opinion from everyone, and so it's trying to, I think, educate and help students understand that. There are so many voices that go into a decision of any kind, such as uniform, that just because it's not exactly how you suggested or exactly the type of feedback that you get, doesn't mean that your feedback wasn't taken into consideration. And I think one of the core things that I think that message is coming through, but one of the key things is that when decisions are made, I think we don't do a good enough job of explaining that to students. So they kind of feel that their views, for example, with uniform, have kind of gone into a black hole and it just completely ignored. And so I think part of the process in any when you're doing it's all very well having students having more input into things, but they also need to the decisions making needs to be explained very, very clearly as to yes, we heard this, we heard this, we heard that, and we had to assimilate all those views and come up with this solution. We did listen to that. We factored in this was the reason why we didn't do that or why we did this. And I think certainly the members of the Every Voice Matters group are starting to understand that, because they meet with me every week and we talk about that process and I give them such examples. But I think for the wider student community, that's an area that I think we still haven't cracked yet, and we still need to figure out how we can do a better job on that. Yeah.
All right, Fab, thank you. We have one final question, and Swati is going to launch the poll. From Perlita, what specific practices or routines can we strengthen or introduce to fully integrate the Every Voice Matters framework into daily classroom interactions and school culture? Quite a big question, that.
What specific practices or routines can we strengthen or introduce? I think making it student-led is a crucial aspect to that, because it shows, the research or having them decide on the areas that matter most to them, I think is absolutely the most fundamental aspect of it. So ensuring that they feel from the very get-go that it's what matters to them is the core thing. So me telling them, oh, we're going to give you more input into this area of the school, and then expecting them simply to be happy because we're giving them more input is not really enough. It's having them decide what's actually important to them. So me saying, I'm going to give you more input into this, it might not be important to them at all. So I think in terms of the specific practice, I think setting up a group, initial consultation with students to ask what is it that's actually important to you, that you feel that you actually want to have more say in. I think that would be a specific practice that you could do. And when we talk about routines, like I made it a weekly thing. So our meetings were weekly. We met every Thursday for the whole year to do that. And I think you used that word routine there, Perlita, and I think it has to become routine. It can't be a once-off thing. It has to be embedded and into the culture of the school, that you put it in the calendar. It's something that you honor and you follow through every week. And I think that's how you build that trust. So it takes time, I think, and that's what I've noticed this year. There's a lot of skepticism at the beginning about how effective the whole project was going to be. But when we saw things like the teacher recruitment process change, where we had a panel of students set up, I thought that was kind of what would you call it, breaking through the glass roof, if you like. It was like that moment where actually we've done that, and it took time, but we got there and we did it, and it's something tangible that they can actually see has had an improvement, that their voice actually led to a significant change.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, thank you everyone. We're coming to the end of our session. Matthew, it's been awesome. Thank you for your time. I know it's so much effort to host a webinar and get all those slides and everything together. I think your current school is very lucky, but also your new school is very lucky, because I'm pretty sure you're going to take your learnings from your fellowship program to your new school there as well. So best of luck, congratulations, and thank you everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.